The sands of Egypt knew their rhythms. For thousands of years, the sun rose and set on a world fixed in its place, a world governed by the ancient, sprawling power of the Ottoman Sultanate. But on one humid morning in early July 1798, that rhythm was not just disturbed, it was violently shattered. The sea, usually an ally of stasis, boiled with sails. A massive armada, stretching from horizon to horizon, carried not just an army, but a new kind of terror. This was not a raid by buccaneers or a temporary incursion by rivals. This was destiny arriving on a fleet of transports. 40,000 men. 300 ships. The French Armée d'Orient. This was a logistical masterpiece conceived by a mind that saw entire continents as chessboards. They landed near Alexandria under the shroud of a Mediterranean mist, moving with a speed and precision that defied the very nature of desert warfare. The local Mamluk defenders, the proud, powerful military caste of Egypt, watched the landing from their magnificent horses. They were armed with scimitars and ancient muskets. They looked upon this relentless, disciplined tide of European infantry and felt a chill that cut deeper than any desert wind. They faced the most efficient, most modern killing machine the world had ever produced. The subsequent attack on Alexandria was swift, brutal, and utterly without mercy. The ancient, decaying walls of the city offered no resistance to the concentrated fury of modern French cannon. Within hours, the fortress that had stood as a sentinel of civilization for 2 millennia was a smoking ruin. The Mamluk cavalry, renowned for their courage but hopelessly outmatched, charged into a dense, unbreakable hail of musket fire and fixed bayonets. They died by the hundred, their romantic charge rendered obsolete by cold, Enlightenment-era arithmetic. This was not war, it was a clinical, one-sided execution designed to break the will of an entire region. But the fall of Alexandria was more than just a military conquest. It was a message delivered with the sheer shockwave of a bombardment. The world's oldest empire, the colossal, sprawling domain of the Ottoman sultans, was exposed. Fragile. Ripe for collapse. Napoleon Bonaparte, the architect of this terror, was not just fighting the Mamluks, he was challenging the very stability of the global order. No power had dared to strike so deeply, so quickly, at the heart of the Levant. The doors to Constantinople, to the Persian Gulf, and critically, to India, the jewel of the British Empire, had just been violently kicked open. The military genius of Napoleon was not just his audacity, but his speed. He consolidated his position with ruthless efficiency, eliminating all resistance and establishing a new, French order overnight. He was an unstoppable tide, one who saw weakness and exploited it with a velocity no monarch or politician could comprehend. He had already broken the spirit of Europe, now he was poised to break the ancient, sluggish world of the East. For the Ottoman commanders watching from Damascus and Istanbul, and for the British government in distant London, the terror was absolute. The man who had conquered Europe in principle was now poised to conquer the East in fact. His presence in Egypt was not an endpoint, it was a springboard. With the British fleet gone after the Battle of the Nile, there was now a catastrophic power vacuum on land. Every single defense, every single garrison, every single city between Alexandria and Constantinople was deemed inadequate. They possessed neither the strength, the modern tactics, nor the resources to stop the Armée d'Orient. The entire strategic balance of the planet rested on the next mile of Napoleon's march. In the summer of 1798, after the day that should have been a massacre but became an effortless conquest, the only question was not if the East would fall, but merely when it would be utterly and finally consumed. The odds were already stacked beyond all comprehension. The victory at Alexandria was a whisper compared to the roar that followed. The world's elite, the politicians in London, the diplomats in Vienna, the anxious Sultan in Istanbul, they quickly realized that the man now surveying the ruins of the Mamluk power was no ordinary invader. Napoleon Bonaparte was not interested in settling in Egypt. He saw Egypt as a launchpad, a crucial piece in a far grander, terrifyingly logical design. His gaze was fixed eastward, across the unforgiving, sun-baked terrain of the Levant. The ultimate prize was not merely Jerusalem or Damascus. The ultimate prize was India. The British referred to it as the jewel in the crown. For Napoleon, it was the indispensable pillar of his greatest rival's power. If he could sever the British connection to the subcontinent, the entire global structure of the British Empire would instantly, irrevocably collapse. He saw himself as the cartographer of a new world order, and the essential line on his map ran directly through Syria and Palestine. To reach India by land, Napoleon had to secure the Syrian corridor, the ancient coastal route. This narrow strip of land, containing cities like Jaffa and Acre, was the choke point. Control the Levant, and you controlled the shortest, fastest land route to the Persian Gulf. This move was predicated on a ruthless, tactical necessity. The French had been cut off from the sea by Nelson at the Nile, but Napoleon simply dismissed the navy as irrelevant. He would use the land itself as his ship. This shift was revolutionary, a general refusing to be constrained by naval power, instead choosing to fight an entirely new kind of global war, relying solely on the legs and rifles of his infantry. Moreover, the campaign was not isolated. It was part of a meticulously planned global pincer movement. In India, the formidable Tipu Sultan of Mysore, a long-standing and bitter enemy of the British East India Company, waited impatiently for Napoleon's arrival. Tipu and Napoleon had been corresponding for months. The plan was terrifyingly simple. French forces would march across the Levant, seize the Gulf, link up with Tipu's army, and together they would drive the British into the sea. The resources, the manpower, and the geopolitical weight of this Franco-Mysorean alliance would be overwhelming. It was a guaranteed, fatal blow. The move into Syria was therefore not an option but a command, the critical second step that would initiate the global earthquake. The logistics were harrowing, the distances vast, but Napoleon had already proven that his will could overcome any physical boundary. He possessed a relentless, almost messianic belief in his own destiny, a conviction that his army was an unstoppable force of fate. This psychological certainty was his most powerful weapon. His troops believed him, and the desperate, scattered defenders of the Levant already feared him. They knew the next city to fall would confirm the inevitability of Napoleon's triumph. Every British soldier, every Ottoman official, understood this single, terrifying truth: the fate of the entire world, and the survival of the world's greatest maritime power, now depended on the ability of a handful of forgotten, isolated garrisons to stop an unstoppable tide. The stage was set for a truly impossible confrontation. For the anxious, beleaguered diplomats and generals of the British Empire, the summer of 1798 brought one blinding, undeniable moment of triumph. It was the news from Aboukir Bay, known to history as the Battle of the Nile. Admiral Horatio Nelson, the celebrated firebrand of the Royal Navy, had achieved the impossible. He had caught the seemingly untouchable French fleet at anchor, attacked at dusk, and delivered a punishing, catastrophic blow. 10 of the French line-of-battle ships were sunk or captured. The flag of the French Republic was torn from the sea. The news was greeted in London with delirious, unparalleled celebration. The stock market soared. Church bells rang for days. Britain, and indeed all of Europe, believed the threat was over. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who dared to challenge destiny, was now cut off. His entire army was marooned in the sands of Egypt. They were isolated, surrounded by hostile territory, and denied all communication and supply from France. The nightmare of a French empire in the East seemed to have ended before it even began. But this momentary relief was built upon a fatal strategic irony. Nelson's victory, while absolute, came at a staggering cost. The British fleet itself was battered, wounded, and exhausted. Ships of the line, their hulls pierced and masts shattered, desperately required immediate, extensive repair. Nelson himself was severely injured. To secure his monumental victory and save his remaining ships, he was forced to withdraw. The surviving British force limped away toward Naples and Sicily, leaving behind a silence on the waves that was more dangerous than any French armada. The British had eliminated the French navy, but in doing so, they had also unintentionally eliminated their own presence in the eastern Mediterranean. The empty sea, the very symbol of Britain's mastery, was now a geopolitical vacuum. Napoleon, stranded but unbowed, saw the opportunity immediately. The land, not the sea, was his stage. The sea could deliver men, but it could not stop a determined march. With no British fleet patrolling the coast, there was no one to coordinate intelligence, no one to supply the meager coastal fortresses, and no one to provide vital naval artillery support. The French were trapped in Egypt, yes, but they were also, ironically, free to march towards Syria. London's relief soon curdled into confusion and then icy dread. Their greatest naval victory had inadvertently given the world's greatest land commander the uncontested freedom of movement across the land bridge connecting Africa and Asia. Napoleon's unstoppable tide, which had been temporarily dammed by Nelson's genius, now simply found a way around the obstacle. The entire focus of the campaign shifted. The battle was no longer about controlling the Nile, but about controlling a few, dilapidated ports on the Syrian coast. It was this silence, this absence of British might on the water, that defined the impossible odds of the coming siege. The Ottoman forts, decaying and antique, were now utterly alone. They were expected to face the disciplined vanguard of the French army, their siege artillery, the best in the world, and their commander, who had never known a serious defeat. The ultimate despair lay in the realization that the British Empire, the supreme maritime power, was now utterly helpless to intervene in its own greatest crisis. All the gold in the Bank of England, all the cannon on the decks of the Royal Navy, could not stop a single column of French infantry marching through the Levant. The fate of India, and the fate of the collapsing Ottoman world, was now placed entirely upon the shoulders of whomever, or whatever, could somehow manage to fill that deadly, empty space. Having solidified his hold on Egypt, Napoleon prepared his army for the march across the treacherous Sinai Peninsula and into the Levant. This was the moment of transition, from occupation to conquest, from regional dominance to global strategy. The target was the chain of ancient, coastal cities that served as the northern gate to Syria and the true route to the east. The first major domino to fall was the city of Jaffa. Jaffa was a medieval fortress, a warren of stone and narrow streets, garrisoned by thousands of Ottoman and Albanian troops. When Napoleon arrived in March 1799, he expected a brief engagement. What he got was fierce, determined resistance. The defenders, fueled by desperation and commanded by the memory of centuries of conflict, fought with a savage intensity that surprised even the hardened French veterans. The siege of Jaffa was short but horrific. After a sustained, punishing bombardment, the French engineers managed to breach the antiquated walls. The assault that followed was a dizzying, brutal cataract of street fighting, where muskets were abandoned for bayonets and sabers. The city fell into French hands, but only after suffering terrifying casualties. What followed, however, was not the typical, if brutal, conclusion of a siege. It was a calculated, cold-blooded act of psychological warfare designed to send a tremor of paralyzing fear across the entire Levant. Napoleon found himself with thousands of prisoners, estimates range between 3,000 and 5,000. The vast majority were Ottoman and Albanian soldiers, many of whom had already been paroled once before in Egypt, having sworn not to fight the French again. Transporting and feeding these prisoners in the harsh desert conditions was a logistical nightmare. Releasing them was strategically untenable. They would simply rearm and rejoin the next garrison down the road. The calculation was made with chilling military logic. Napoleon issued the order. In the days that followed, the French soldiers executed the prisoners en masse on the beach south of the city. For 4 days, the sound of musket volleys echoed across the dunes. Thousands were systematically slain, some shot, some drowned, some dispatched with bayonets to conserve ammunition. It was an atrocity of breathtaking scale, an act of sheer, terrifying pragmatism. This massacre at Jaffa served a definitive purpose. It transformed Napoleon's army from a mere military force into an avatar of unrelenting fate. It was a deliberate, overt message delivered to every single city, garrison, and village that lay between Jaffa and the gates of Constantinople. The message was this: resistance is futile. Surrender immediately, or face extermination. The psychology worked. News traveled fast, carried by terrified refugees and the stench of death left behind on the beaches. The effect on morale in the remaining Ottoman garrisons was devastating. The will to fight was not just diminished, it was shattered. Why endure a brutal siege only to be executed on the sands when you could surrender and hope for better terms? This context of terror is absolutely critical. By the time Napoleon turned his eyes north toward his next target, a small, dilapidated port city called Acre, the psychological battle was already won. The city of Acre was now staring at not just an army of 40,000 men, but at the very embodiment of ruthless, unstoppable terror. The fear generated at Jaffa was the final, overwhelming element of the impossible odds facing the defenders of the next domino. As Napoleon carved his path of terror through the Levant, the stage was set for an epic clash, but the true hero would be the most unlikely, the most controversial, and the most fiercely independent man in the British service, Commodore Sir Sidney Smith. In the rigid, highly stratified world of the late 18th century Royal Navy, Sidney Smith was an anomaly, a rogue star that glittered too brightly for the staid admirals of the Admiralty. He was a man defined not by the slow, painful climb of seniority, but by sheer, outrageous energy and a flair for the dramatic. Born into minor gentry, Smith displayed a reckless, adventurous spirit from his youth. Unlike most officers, he was not content merely to sail the waters. He sailed the world's diplomatic and espionage back channels. He was a spy, a diplomat, a political manipulator, and only incidentally, a naval officer. His education was as broad as his appetite for danger, making him fluent in French, a student of military history, and an utterly unconventional thinker. Crucially, Smith's early career was marked by dazzling success followed by spectacular controversy. He served with distinction in the American War of Independence, but after the peace, he did the unthinkable. He sold his services to the King of Sweden, fighting brilliantly against the Russians. This act, serving a foreign power without explicit British permission, earned him admiration in Stockholm and deep suspicion in London. He was an officer of the Royal Navy who was perpetually outside the established chain of command, a source of constant irritation to his superiors, including the famously prickly Admiral Nelson, who considered him arrogant and a meddling amateur. Smith's methods were the antithesis of the methodical, calculated warfare perfected by Napoleon. Where the French general relied on flawless logistics and predictable, overwhelming force, Smith relied on audacity, improvisation, and personality. He viewed military engagement not as a mathematical equation but as a psychological duel. His greatest strength was his ability to inspire intense, personal loyalty from the most disparate, unlikely band of followers, a skill honed during years spent navigating the chaos of European politics. When he was finally given a command by the British government, it was a thankless, complex, and politically poisonous assignment. He was appointed Joint Minister Plenipotentiary to the Ottoman Porte. This meant his job was not just to fight ships but to manage the entire diplomatic, military, and financial relationship with the centuries-old Sultanate. He was given a tiny squadron, 2 ships of the line, and effectively dumped into the cauldron of the eastern Mediterranean, far from supervision, far from support, and far from the comfortable predictability of conventional naval warfare. It was precisely this unique combination of diplomatic authority, independent command, and proven recklessness that placed him, entirely by chance, in the path of Napoleon's destiny. This was the man, the diplomatic maverick, the controversial adventurer, the self-proclaimed hero, who would soon become the only person standing between Napoleon Bonaparte and the ultimate prize, the collapse of the British Empire. He was the forgotten genius, the impossible variable that Napoleon's clinical calculations had entirely failed to account for. No military manual would have assigned this role to Sidney Smith, but fate, in its most dramatic irony, was about to. Sidney Smith's unique understanding of the French psyche, and his capacity for the dramatic gesture, was forged not on the high seas, but within the claustrophobic stone walls of one of Paris's most notorious prisons. His greatest humiliation led directly to his most defining skill, an absolute mastery of personal resourcefulness and psychological warfare. In 1796, while undertaking a daring operation to destroy the remaining French fleet in the port of Le Havre, Smith's small boat was unexpectedly surrounded. He was captured, taken to France, and immediately recognized by the Directory. To the nascent French Republic, Smith was not merely a prisoner of war, he was an existential enemy, a reckless spy who continually disrupted their coastal operations. He was interned in the Temple prison in Paris, a gloomy, imposing medieval fortress that had recently housed the doomed royal family. This was a fate worse than any battlefield death. Smith was deemed too valuable to exchange and too dangerous to release. He was held under the most stringent security, effectively left to rot, a permanent trophy of the Republic's triumph over the British intelligence machine. But captivity did not break Smith, it defined him. Confined to his cell, Smith refused to submit to the isolation. He began a meticulous, 2-year campaign of seduction, bribery, and psychological manipulation. He charmed his guards, learning their routines, their weaknesses, and their politics. He maintained an air of buoyant, almost carefree arrogance, convincing his captors that he was a harmless eccentric, all while weaving a clandestine web of escape. His greatest accomplishment was infiltrating the network of French royalists still operating within Paris, those secretly dreaming of restoring the monarchy. Through smuggled notes and covert meetings, Smith established contact with Philippot, a French engineer and royalist sympathizer. This connection was vital, but Smith knew a simple breakout was impossible. It required a piece of theatrical genius. The escape, when it finally happened in April 1798, was conducted with operatic flair. Smith, aided by Philippot, faked an official release order, complete with seals, signatures, and a convincing story that the Directory had secretly pardoned him. He stepped out of the Temple prison, not through a broken lock or a midnight tunnel, but through the front gate, under the gaze of his own guards, who believed they were merely following an administrative directive. He and Philippot spent days hidden in Paris, slipping past the revolutionary patrols, before finally escaping to the coast and making a dramatic dash for freedom, eventually reaching safety in London. The effect of this escape on Napoleon and the French command was immense. It was a profound embarrassment to the Directory, proving that the British were not only masters of the sea but could infiltrate the very heart of the revolution. It confirmed to Napoleon that Smith was not merely an officer, but a personal nemesis, a trickster whose audacity defied all military protocol and logic. More importantly, it left Smith with two critical advantages for the Siege of Acre. First, he took Philippot, one of the best French military engineers, with him. This engineer would be instrumental in fixing Acre's defenses. Second, and most vitally, the escape earned Smith the deep, personal, visceral hatred of Napoleon Bonaparte. This hatred meant that Napoleon would inevitably underestimate Smith, viewing him not as a serious threat, but as a reckless, irritating nuisance to be easily swept aside. This rebirth in Paris transformed Smith from a rogue officer into a man defined by survival against impossible odds, the only kind of man capable of standing up to the unstoppable tide of Napoleon. Acre, or Saint-Jean-d'Acre, sits on the coast of the Levant like a jagged, stubborn thumb jutting into the Mediterranean. Its stones are saturated with history, having served as the last bastion of the Crusader kingdom, a key port for the Ottoman trade, and a strategic anchor for centuries. It was the crucial node on the coastal route, the city that Napoleon absolutely had to possess to continue his march toward Damascus and beyond. But Acre, for all its history, was a fortress of fatal flaws. Firstly, its very age was its biggest vulnerability. The central defenses, the massive inner walls, the towers, they had been constructed during the medieval era. They were designed to withstand the siege engines and rudimentary artillery of the Crusades, built to resist pounding, not penetration. They were thick, but soft. They lacked the layered, scientific resilience of modern 18th-century fortifications. Secondly, and perhaps more crucially, the city's recent garrisoning had been a disaster. Acre was governed by a local Ottoman official, Geza Pasha, known to everyone simply as the Butcher. Geza was a brutal, capricious tyrant, feared by his own people as much as by his enemies. He maintained the fortress not through military genius, but through sheer terror, ensuring loyalty only through constant, ruthless executions. Under his misrule, the walls had been neglected. Repairs were shoddy, The outer defenses had decayed, and the crucial moat had silted up, becoming less of a defensive barrier and more of a muddy ditch. When Napoleon turned his gaze toward Acre, he saw not a defiant fortress, but a ripe melon ready to split open. His intelligence was clear, the garrison was disorganized, the walls were antique, and the morale was broken by the news of the Jaffa massacre. His engineers estimated they could breach the main wall in 3 days with sustained, modern cannon fire. The most critical tactical deficiency lay in the placement of the defense. The western and northern sides, facing the sea and the open Mediterranean, were heavily fortified against naval attack. But Napoleon was approaching from the south and east, the landward approach. Here, the crucial defense was a simple stretch of wall centered on a powerful, but ancient, structure known as the Cursed Tower or the Wall of the Unbelievers. This wall had not seen serious conflict since the 13th century. It was precisely this neglect, this fatal flaw, that confirmed the overwhelming odds. Napoleon was bringing the most scientifically advanced siegecraft against a city built to resist Richard the Lionheart. It was the clash of the 18th century's relentless future against the 13th century's crumbling past. If Acre fell, and all military logic, all engineering precedent, dictated that it must fall swiftly, the door to the Levant would be wide open. There were no further fortified positions of any consequence between Acre and the heart of the Ottoman Empire. The fall of this single, dilapidated fortress would not just secure the route to India, it would confirm Napoleon's messianic self-belief and break the spine of the entire Near East. Acre was a death trap waiting for the executioner to arrive. The decision was made, the march was ordered. After the horror of Jaffa, the French Army d'Orient began its advance north toward Acre. This movement initiated a deadly, desperate race against a clock governed by geography, logistics, and fate. Napoleon's strategy was founded on speed, a lightning-fast campaign designed to exploit the psychological advantage gained at Jaffa. He was calculating not merely days, but hours. He knew that the only thing that could save Acre was the eventual arrival of massive Ottoman relief forces from Anatolia, or, heaven forbid, the unexpected reappearance of a British naval force. His solution was to move so fast, and besiege the city so swiftly, that Acre would fall long before any meaningful help could arrive. The core of his army, the infantry and cavalry, moved with terrifying efficiency. They were hardened by years of campaigning and driven by the formidable energy of their commander. But the essence of a modern siege lay not in men, but in metal. The great, heavy artillery, the massive 18-pounder cannon required to reduce medieval stone walls to rubble, could not be transported quickly across the desolate, trackless desert. Therefore, Napoleon entrusted his siege train, the crucial cannon, barrels of powder, engineers' tools, and the massive balls of iron, to a small, heavily protected convoy traveling by sea. This was a necessary compromise. Transporting the heavy ordnance by water, hugging the coastal road, was infinitely faster than attempting to drag the enormous weight across the shifting sands and rocky terrain. The sea convoy, though small and vulnerable, was the lifeline of the entire Syrian campaign. It was the key to Napoleon's timetable. If the convoy arrived on schedule, Acre would be his within the week, and the route to India would be clear. Meanwhile, the defenders of Acre, or those who should have been its defenders, were in a state of confused paralysis. Jeza Pasha, the butcher, had minimal intelligence on the French movements and even less desire to expose his own troops unnecessarily. The few messages dispatched to Istanbul pleading for help faced weeks of delay. The Ottoman system was simply too vast, too bureaucratic, and too slow to react to the lightning-fast, revolutionary warfare waged by Napoleon. The distance between the French army and Acre was shrinking daily. Every night of rest, every sunrise over the dunes, brought Napoleon's forces closer to their goal. The defenders of Acre had less than a week, perhaps only days, before the main French army would be deploying its batteries and beginning the fatal bombardment. The odds were defined by this clock. On the French side, a disciplined, ruthless army was closing rapidly, carrying the psychological weight of the Jaffa massacre. Their heavy ordnance, the only tool capable of breaching Acre's walls, was sailing just offshore, minutes away from delivery. On the other side, an aging, inadequate fortress stood almost naked, its defenders isolated and facing the greatest general of the age. The crucial intersection of destiny was about to occur. It was a race between Napoleon's landbound fury and the silent, vulnerable ships sailing parallel to the coast, a convoy carrying the means of Acre's immediate annihilation. And sailing directly toward that vulnerable convoy, entirely unaware of the historical weight he was about to intercept, was the flamboyant, unpredictable Commodore Sidney Smith. While the French infantry were enduring the brutal march across the Sinai, and Jezza Pasha was brooding fearfully within Acre's crumbling walls, the man destined to become the city's savior was operating hundreds of miles away, pursuing a loose and vaguely defined mission. Sir Sidney Smith was cruising near the island of Rhodes, fulfilling his primary duty, liaising with the Ottoman fleet. Smith was entirely ignorant of Napoleon's immediate movements. He knew the French general was in Egypt, and he suspected a northern advance was imminent, but the precise nature of the threat, the timeline, the force, the urgency, was completely hidden from him. He was a small, isolated British naval presence in a vast, empty sea. It was this profound ignorance, coupled with his characteristic desire for independent action, that set up the greatest twist of fate in the entire campaign. On the evening of March 16, 1799, Smith's small squadron, comprised of his flagship HMS Tiger and the accompanying HMS Theseus, encountered a small, nondescript flotilla of ships sailing south along the coast. It was a dark, breezy night, and the sight was not immediately alarming. These were small coastal vessels, seemingly civilian, flying Turkish colors. However, Smith's instincts, honed over years of spying and rogue operations, were sharper than those of any conventional officer. Something felt wrong about the posture and number of the ships. He ordered a close inspection. As the British ships closed in, the truth was revealed. The flotilla was not Turkish. It was the crucial, heavily guarded French sea convoy, carrying the entire siege train required for the fall of Acre. The vessels were laden, low in the water, and deeply vulnerable. The ensuing engagement was not a grand, tactical naval battle, it was a swift, one-sided ambush. The small French escorts were overwhelmed and forced to surrender almost instantly. The prize seized by Smith was staggering, completely altering the geometry of the entire campaign. The British captured 2 corvettes, 7 gunboats, and critical stores, including an immense stockpile of ammunition. But the true gold lay in the cargo, the heavy siege artillery, the massive 18-pounder and 24-pounder cannon, along with their carriages and thousands of iron balls. This was not a victory of strategy, it was a fluke of destiny, a cosmic intervention. If Smith had been 10 miles further east, or a day later, or had obeyed the orders of his superiors to stay near Rhodes, the convoy would have made it safely to the port of Haifa, just south of Acre. The seizure of the siege train was the single most defining moment of the siege, occurring before the siege had even formally begun. Napoleon's iron fist was marching north, but his teeth, his indispensable, wall-breaking cannon, were now in the hands of his bitter personal rival. Smith instantly grasped the monumental significance of his accidental prize. He ordered the fastest possible movement north, racing his 2 ships and the captured ordnance toward Acre. The French infantry were now closing on a city they expected to be lightly defended and ready for immediate bombardment. Instead, they were marching toward a city that was about to receive the most crucial, miraculous defensive reinforcement imaginable. The clock had not just been reset, it had been violently turned back. The game had changed from a certain French conquest to a desperate, head-to-head confrontation defined by the sheer audacity of one man's unscheduled appearance. Smith had executed his accidental masterstroke, but the job was far from over. The real race now began, to get the captured French guns mounted and functional on Acre's rotten walls before Napoleon's advance guard came into view. He sailed the small convoy directly into Acre's harbor. His arrival was met with a chaotic mixture of disbelief, relief, and profound suspicion. Jezza Pasha, the butcher, a man who trusted no one, least of all an English naval officer with a reputation for reckless diplomacy, was not immediately welcoming. Smith's authority was based on a tenuous title, Joint Minister Plenipotentiary to the Sublime Porte. This title granted him diplomatic weight but offered zero military command over the Pasha's Albanian and Ottoman garrison. Yet, Smith, the quintessential rogue diplomat, ignored the legal complexities. He immediately took de facto control of the defense, acting with a force of personality that overwhelmed Jez's paranoid reluctance. His first, immediate priority was the ordnance. The vast, heavy French cannon were urgently dragged from the captured ships, hauled up the unstable embankment, and wrestled into position. This was a brutal, grueling effort demanding sheer muscle and engineering ingenuity. Smith immediately tasked the French royalist engineer, Colonel Philippot, whom he had broken out of the Temple prison, with this impossible job. Philippot, having worked on the most modern French fortifications, instantly recognized the catastrophic vulnerability of Acre's walls. He didn't have time for extensive repairs. Instead, he worked frantically to reinforce the weakest sections with whatever was available: earth, timber, and the very stones of the ancient city itself. His most crucial intervention was in setting up the newly acquired French 18-pounders. These cannon, intended to smash the walls, would now be used to defend them. Meanwhile, Smith established the tiny core of the professional defense. His entire land force consisted of less than 300 men, a small detachment of Royal Marines and the crews of the Tiger and Theseus, who were converted from sailors into makeshift infantry and artillery crews. These men, hardened by naval discipline and superior training, were instantly deployed to key points on the crumbling ramparts, positioned to stiffen the morale of the thousands of hesitant Ottoman defenders. Smith's genius lay in integration. He didn't try to replace Jez's forces. He sought to inject discipline and technology into the existing chaos. The British sailors were placed side by side with Jez's Albanian soldiers and Mamluk cavalry, creating a bizarre, multinational, and utterly volatile garrison. The race concluded with Napoleon's arrival. On March 20, 1799, the vanguard of the French Army d'Orient crested the hill overlooking Acre. Napoleon, peering through his field glass, saw the expected, vulnerable city. But as his eyes swept the harbor, he registered a devastating, infuriating sight: the British naval ensign flying defiantly from the masts of the Tiger and the Theseus, anchored menacingly close to the shore. It was worse than that. As his engineers scouted the walls, they reported the unbelievable truth. The very cannon Napoleon had relied upon, the 18-pounders that were supposed to be smashing the Turkish defenses, were now prominently mounted on the ramparts, aimed directly back at his own approaching army. The man who defied kings had arrived. The clock had run out for Napoleon. The invasion that should have been a walkover had, in a single, accidental intervention, been transformed into a desperate, existential siege. The impossible odds had shifted, not in Acre's favor, but into a state of bewildering, precarious equilibrium. The air above Acre, usually thick with the smell of spices and the sea, was now choked with the metallic stench of cordite. Napoleon's fury, thwarted by the audacious intervention of his nemesis, translated instantly into a concentrated, relentless bombardment. The siege began on March 20, 1799. The French artillery, though lacking the heavy cannon captured by Smith, was still considerable. Lighter field guns and howitzers began pounding the landward walls, targeting the crucial northeastern angle and the medieval tower that Philippot was desperately trying to reinforce. Napoleon had intended for a rapid, psychological victory, a swift crack of the whip to force a surrender. Instead, he found himself facing a methodical, disciplined resistance that was both unexpected and deeply irritating. He had anticipated panic, he encountered resolve. The opening salvos immediately exposed Acre's fatal architectural flaws. The ancient stones were not strong enough to resist the concentrated impact of even the lighter French shot. The walls began to crumble, not slowly, but in dramatic, dusty clouds. The key defensive position, the so-called Cursed Tower, suffered severe damage almost immediately. But here, the presence of the British personnel became the defining difference. The Ottoman gunners, while brave, often lacked the training to sustain rapid fire and manage the complex logistics of a crowded, collapsing battery. Smith's sailors, working the captured French guns, operated with the practiced efficiency of a naval crew. They employed the system of rapid reloading and sighting that was standard on British warships, turning the old, patched-up ramparts into a deadly, effective firing platform. This created a fierce artillery duel. For every shot the French fired into the walls, the guns manned by the British crews answered back, their aim surprisingly accurate, targeting the French battery positions with a tenacity that slowed the pace of the enemy sapping and trench digging. Smith, meanwhile, demonstrated his personal mastery of the psychological game. He had runners constantly moving along the walls, delivering water, encouraging the Ottoman troops, and, critically, making his visible presence known at the most dangerous points. He was not merely directing, he was inspiring. His mere existence on the wall was a statement. The West had not abandoned the East, and Napoleon's momentum had finally met a human obstacle. The first few days were a brutal test of endurance. The French fire was overwhelming, forcing the defenders to abandon some of the forward positions. But the defenders did not flee. They fell back into the inner works, where Philippoa's hasty reinforcements provided temporary cover. The intensity of the French attack was driven by Napoleon's acute awareness of the clock. Every day the siege continued, his position grew weaker. Disease was inevitable. The desert environment was taking its toll. And every day brought the threat of the massive Ottoman relief army closer. The opening salvo, therefore, was not merely an attempt to breach the wall, it was a race to shatter the defenders' morale before their physical defenses completely failed. But the defenders, buoyed by the sight of the resolute British sailors and the presence of their audacious commodore, held firm. They turned what should have been a brief, decisive artillery phase into a prolonged, costly exchange. Napoleon was now forced to fight a siege not against a collapsing garrison, but against a determined coalition armed with his own stolen cannon, and led by the one man who had successfully defied him before. The French strategy was not solely dependent on cannonballs, it was equally reliant on the crippling psychological shadow cast by the massacre at Jaffa. Napoleon fully expected the Ottoman soldiers, demoralized and facing certain annihilation, to break and abandon their posts the moment the walls began to crumble. But in Acre, terror met a different, older, and equally unforgiving kind of discipline, the iron rule of Geza Pasha. Geza, the butcher, was a man whose cruelty was legendary, but whose ruthlessness ironically served as a bulwark against French fear. His garrison, a volatile mix of Albanians, Mamluks, Turks, and local Arab soldiers, was kept in line by a fear of Napoleon that was perhaps less immediate than the fear of their own commander. Geza was known to execute soldiers for cowardice instantly and publicly, ensuring that the penalty for retreating often seemed swifter and more certain than the risk of fighting the French. This ruthless discipline created what can only be described as a wall of flesh. The Ottoman troops were highly effective in the desperate, close-quarters combat for which Napoleon's army was about to test them. They fought not with the Enlightenment ideals of the French, but with a simple, brutal contract. Loyalty to the Pasha meant survival. Smith understood this dynamic perfectly. His role was not to replace Geza's authority, but to leverage it. He recognized that the courage of the Ottoman soldiers was undeniable, even if their technical skills were lacking. The British Marines and sailors became the steel spine of the defense, placed at the most critical points, the gun batteries and the threatened breaches, to provide professional example and ensure the line never quite fractured. The psychological warfare began to fail Napoleon. The defenders absorbed the incessant French fire, saw their comrades fall, and watched the walls melt away, but they did not scatter. They looked to the steady, unyielding presence of the small British contingent, and they looked to the terrifying certainty of the Pasha's retribution. The terror from Jaffa was meeting its match in the local, absolute terror of Acre's own ruler. This unlikely coalition, the reckless, charismatic British Commodore, the brutal, autocratic Ottoman Pasha, and the handful of French royalist engineers, was holding the line not through superior firepower, but through a fusion of modern discipline and ancient, unforgiving command. The siege was dragging into its third week, and Napoleon, who had planned for a decisive, swift conclusion, was now bogged down in a battle of attrition against a garrison that, by all rational standards, should have evaporated. The sheer endurance of this human war was forcing Napoleon to commit to a sustained, costly investment he could not afford. Despite the determined defense and the infuriating presence of Sidney Smith, Napoleon's artillery was slowly, inexorably, doing its work. The raw power of the French batteries, even without their captured heavy guns, was a force that the medieval stone of Acre could not withstand indefinitely. Weeks into the siege, the focus of the French bombardment narrowed to a single, critical weakness: the northern corner, centered on the most exposed section of the medieval fortifications. This area was pounded day and night, transforming stone and mortar into a billowing cloud of choking dust and debris. Then, the moment of absolute crisis arrived. On the morning of April 21, 1799, after nearly a month of sustained punishment, a catastrophic section of the ancient wall finally gave way. With a colossal, grinding roar that shook the entire city, the masonry collapsed inward, creating a deep, ragged hole in the perimeter. This was the breach, a physical rupture in the defense that, by all established military doctrine, signaled the end of the siege. The French troops, watching from their siege trenches, let out a massive, unified cheer. They saw the breach not just as a hole in the wall, but as an open doorway to victory. This was the moment they had been trained for, the point where discipline and overwhelming force were brought to bear against a terrified, collapsing defense. Inside Acre, the scene was one of dizzying chaos. Dust filled the air, visibility dropped to zero, and the Ottoman defenders nearest the collapse were momentarily paralyzed. Panic was not just a threat, it was a near certainty. Jezza Pasha's men knew that once the French were inside the walls, the massacre at Jaffa would be repeated here, instantly and personally. Smith and Philippot, however, had anticipated this moment. The instant the wall failed, Philippot directed every available Labour, local Arabs, Greek civilians, and Turkish soldiers, to the base of the collapse. Their frantic job was not to repair the main wall, but to quickly erect a secondary defense, an internal retrenchment composed of sandbags, timber, and debris, immediately behind the breach. This was a desperate, hasty attempt to create a temporary bottleneck. Smith, meanwhile, ensured the crucial British Marine and sailor contingent did not waver. They were moved directly to the breach, not to hold the line, but to anchor it. Their role was to absorb the initial shock and provide the example of unshakable resolve. Napoleon, seeing the unmistakable gap in the defenses, did not hesitate. This was the moment he had calculated. He ordered the first major, general assault. The French columns, eager for the plunder and glory of conquest, surged out of their trenches and rushed toward the smoking, rubble-strewn gap. The fate of Acre, the Levant, and Napoleon's entire destiny now rested on a single, narrow, crumbling fissure in a medieval wall. The defense was broken, the French were coming. The impossible moment had arrived. Napoleon's reaction to the breach was one of absolute, unshakable confidence. He viewed the rupture in the wall as the inevitable result of his superior planning and his destiny. The fall of Acre was now a procedural formality. He was guided by two core assumptions, both rooted in the psychology he had so successfully deployed at Jaffa. His first assumption was numerical panic. The Ottoman troops, seeing the breach, would surely abandon their posts and flee rather than face the terrifying French assault column. His second assumption was strategic weakness. He believed the defense was entirely static, relying only on the strength of the outer wall, with no organized, internal retrenchment prepared. As the French assault columns poured into the trenches, rushing toward the chasm in the wall, Napoleon remained far from the fighting, already planning his continued march into Syria. This physical and mental distance from the immediate action was his first fatal miscalculation. His contempt for the irregular, mixed Ottoman defense blinded him to the reality on the ground. The attack was met not by mass panic, but by organized chaos. The French soldiers, scrambling over the debris, found themselves funneled into a narrow space where Philippot's hurried retrenchment had created a makeshift, temporary wall. This meant that instead of rushing into the heart of the city, the elite French infantry were forced to halt and fight a bottleneck engagement. More shocking still was the nature of the defense they encountered. It wasn't just a hail of desperate musket fire. It was a vicious, coordinated defense of cold steel and close-quarters savagery, anchored by the unyielding discipline of the British Marines and sailors. The sight of the tiny British contingent standing firm in the middle of a collapsing Ottoman fortress was an unexpected psychological blow. The assault failed to gain momentum. The French columns, crowded together in the breach, became easy targets for the point-blank firing positions set up by Smith's men. Hundreds of elite French soldiers, the vanguard of the Army d'Orient, were killed or wounded in minutes, their bodies piling up in the rubble. Napoleon, receiving reports of the stalled assault and the shocking casualty count, was forced to confront an unbearable truth. His strategic assumptions had been demolished by the sheer audacity of one man. His confidence was shattered, replaced by a growing, boiling frustration. He was facing not a broken garrison, but a determined military command. The attack was called off. The breach, the key to the entire campaign, remained clogged with French dead. Napoleon's unstoppable momentum had been brought to a sudden, bloody, and unexpected halt. The siege had now entered a new phase, no longer defined by French aggression, but by their mounting attrition and the stubborn resistance of a man Napoleon had scorned as a mere adventurer. Faced with the failure of the direct assault, Napoleon's engineers were compelled to resort to the most desperate, terrifying form of siegecraft, the subterranean war of mines and countermines. Since the French could not get over the walls, they were determined to bring them down from underneath. This silent war beneath the surface was a realm of profound psychological terror, played out in cramped, earth-choked tunnels where two armies, separated by mere inches of rock, sought to blow each other into oblivion. The French sappers, expert military engineers, began digging deep, narrow tunnels from their forward trenches, aiming to plant massive charges of gunpowder directly under the foundations of the key defensive towers that anchored the breached section of the wall. If successful, these mines would create an entirely new, massive breach, collapsing the secondary defenses and opening the city wide. Smith and Philippot, the French royalist engineer, were acutely aware of this threat. Philippot, knowing French military practice intimately, became the commander of Acre's own countermining operation. This required a constant, frantic effort by Ottoman and civilian laborers, digging trenches parallel to the walls to listen for the faint, telltale sounds of the enemy's pickaxes. Life in these tunnels was a nightmare. The air was thick and foul, the work backbreaking, and the threat of catastrophic, instant death was constant. The engineers would drive wooden stakes into the earth, pressing their ears against them to determine the direction and depth of the French digging. If they heard the French sappers getting too close, a sudden, desperate confrontation would ensue. Sometimes, the counterminers successfully intercepted the French tunnels, leading to vicious, hand-to-hand fights deep underground, a suffocating battle fought with pistols, short swords, and shovels in pitch blackness. More often, the solution was brutal. The defenders would dig a shaft just above the enemy's tunnel and drop massive barrels of water, drowning the French sappers and collapsing the tunnel roof. The pressure on Philippot was immense. He was racing against time and against the very military doctrines he had once studied. In one critical instance, the French successfully placed and detonated a massive mine beneath a section of the wall. The explosion was deafening, killing dozens and creating yet another, shallower breach. But Philippot's counterworks had absorbed enough of the shock to prevent a total structural collapse. The subterranean war became an agonizing stalemate. Every French sapper had to risk being suffocated, drowned, or blown up by their own charges. Every Ottoman and British miner faced the same risk. This constant, unseen conflict drained the resources, morale, and best engineering minds of both armies, proving that the struggle for Acre was not merely confined to the visible ramparts, but was a total war waged above ground and deep beneath the ancient stone foundations. Napoleon's reliance on engineering superiority was being neutralized inch by inch in the darkness. As the bloody stalemate continued on the walls and in the tunnels, Sidney Smith executed his second great tactical intervention, a maneuver that could only have been conceived by a naval officer who refused to accept the conventional boundaries between sea and land warfare. Napoleon's siege strategy depended on his ability to conduct trench warfare in relative safety. His sappers and infantry needed to dig forward, parallel trenches, known as approaches, that would bring them closer to the wall while protecting them from direct enemy fire. This complex, systematic work was essential for success. Smith realized that the French trenches, meticulously dug for protection from the front, were fatally exposed from the side. Specifically, they were exposed to the sea. He ordered his flagship, HMS Tiger, and HMS Theseus to anchor almost recklessly close to the shore. Crucially, he positioned a flotilla of smaller gunboats and armed launches, crewed by his most disciplined sailors, along the northern flank of the French siege lines. This positioning allowed the British ships to deploy enfilading fire. Enfilading fire is military jargon for sweeping the length of an enemy's line from end to end. Instead of firing at the fortified French front, which was heavily protected, Smith's gunboats rained shot and shell sideways down the entire length of the French trenches. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The French soldiers, protected from the city but now completely exposed on their flank, were subjected to a constant, harassing bombardment. The trenches became death traps. The simple act of digging a new approach, or attempting to reinforce a forward position, instantly drew a focused, deadly hail of grapeshot and solid cannonballs from the sea. This maneuver was Smith's masterpiece of coastal defense. It paralyzed the systematic work of the French engineers. Trench digging slowed to a crawl. The movement of fresh troops and supplies became a perilous gamble. Napoleon's meticulous, methodical siege process, the engine of his greatest victories, was thrown into utter disarray by a dozen small boats firing from an unexpected angle. The constant maritime harassment forced Napoleon to divert precious resources and troops to build hasty, inadequate breastworks to protect his trenches from the sea. These were men and materials that should have been reinforcing the attack. The French position was now one of discomfort, exposure, and growing attrition. The naval artillery did not breach the French lines, but it bled them dry. It ensured that every day of the siege became exponentially more costly for Napoleon than it was for the defenders within Acre. It proved that Smith, the former spy and naval rogue, understood the application of combined arms better than the mighty land general facing him. By turning the Mediterranean, Napoleon's obstacle, into Smith's weapon, the Commodore ensured that the siege would not be a sprint to victory, but a prolonged, draining war of will. After enduring weeks of the brutal artillery duel, the subterranean war, and the relentless coastal bombardment, Napoleon decided to end the stalemate with pure, concentrated force. He commanded the first true grand assault on Acre. This was not a probing attack, it was a commitment. The French had managed to reinforce their siege park with a few heavy guns diverted from Egypt, and their sustained fire managed to widen the main breach to a terrifying, yawning gap. Napoleon poured his best troops, veteran grenadiers and disciplined infantry, into the columns, ordering them to push through the rubble and seize the city by force. The moment the French horns sounded the charge, the battlefield dissolved into an unprecedented scene of hand-to-hand savagery. The columns surged into the smoking ruin of the breach. They were immediately met by a concentrated, withering fire from the inner retrenchments, but their momentum was too great to be stopped by musketry alone. The real battle was fought in the confined, suffocating space of the breach itself. It was fought not with strategy, but with bayonets, axes, and daggers. The French fought with the desperate precision of professionals who knew their commander was watching. They clawed their way up the mountain of pulverized stone, determined to break through the final, makeshift defenses. The defenders met them with a ferocity born of absolute certainty, the certainty that surrender meant death. Smith's Marines and sailors, standing shoulder to shoulder with the fierce Albanian and Mamluk fighters, transformed the breach into a meat grinder. The British sailors, accustomed to the confined decks of warships, fought with unusual agility and brutal efficiency in the cramped space. The fighting became a dizzying blur of thrust and parry, a close-quarters duel where no quarter was given. Soldiers slipped on blood-slicked stones, the air was filled with screams, and the constant roar of the fighting made all commands inaudible. The advantage went not to the strongest, but to the most determined and the most desperate. Crucially, the Ottoman soldiers under Jeza Pasha fought like cornered animals. Their use of the yataghan, a short, curved sword, was devastating in the melee. They realized that the space within the breach neutralized the French advantage of volley fire and disciplined formations. Here, it was man against man, and the Ottoman forces, defending their homes and their lives against an army they knew practiced no clemency, fought with astonishing, relentless courage. The assault lasted for hours. The French managed to plant their standard briefly on the inner wall, a moment of profound crisis for the defense, but Smith quickly organized a desperate counterattack, personally throwing a handful of reserves into the melee to push the French back. By the evening, the columns had been repulsed. The grand assault had failed. Napoleon had hurled his best soldiers into the breach and had nothing to show for it but staggering losses. His troops were tired, demoralized, and deeply shaken by the raw, unyielding ferocity of the mixed defense. The hand-to-hand combat had proved that Acre was not Jaffa. Here, the will to live was stronger than the fear of death. The inevitable victory Napoleon had promised was now dripping away, yard by yard, in the ruins of the breached wall. The failure of the first grand assault did nothing to diminish Napoleon's resolve, it only sharpened his tactical ruthlessness. He recognized that brute force was not working and that the morale of the defenders was surprisingly high. His next attempt would not rely on sheer numbers, but on cunning and deception. Napoleon launched his second, more determined assault a few days later. This time, he focused his entire attack on a single, narrow sector of the breach, trying to punch a concentrated hole through the inner retrenchment. The French columns, learning from their previous failure, came forward with greater speed and focus, utilizing the cover of thick smoke and coordinated artillery fire. The initial momentum was overwhelming. The French managed, through sheer weight of bodies, to gain a significant foothold. They pushed past the hastily built inner barricade, and for a critical, terrifying half-hour, it seemed they had finally achieved the breakthrough. They were now fighting in the outer courtyard, just yards from the Pasha's headquarters. It was at this moment, the absolute nadir of the defense, that Sidney Smith executed his masterstroke of psychological deception. Instead of ordering his few remaining reserves into a suicidal countercharge, Smith engineered a feigned retreat. He instructed the Ottoman and British troops closest to the breakthrough to abandon their most forward positions in a highly visible, but controlled, manner. They fell back into the deep shadows of the inner works and surrounding buildings. The French, seeing the defenders suddenly vanish, were seized by a sense of delirious triumph. They believed the resistance had finally shattered. They poured through the main breach and into the outer courtyard, abandoning their tight formation in their eagerness to consolidate the victory. Their focus was entirely on the seemingly clear path ahead. The trap snapped shut immediately. As the bulk of the French column entered the courtyard, they found themselves not in open city streets, but in a carefully chosen kill zone. From the rooftops, the concealed embrasures, and the flanking alleys they had just retreated into, the defenders opened up with a furious, point-blank ambush. A prepositioned force of Mamluk riflemen and British sharpshooters unleashed a devastating crossfire. The tightly packed French soldiers, trapped between the walls and the sudden, overwhelming volume of fire, were cut down with horrific efficiency. The unexpected, hidden carnage demoralized the attack more effectively than any frontal charge. The French realized they hadn't seized victory, they had walked into an absolute slaughter. The French High Command ordered a desperate, chaotic retreat, stumbling back over their dead comrades. The trap was sprung, and the vicious ambush ensured that Napoleon's second major push was repulsed even more decisively than the first. Smith's tactical genius had successfully turned Napoleon's confidence and momentum against him, using deception to multiply the power of his vastly inferior force. The weeks that followed the ambush became the siege of despair for Napoleon. The relentless attrition, the failure of successive assaults, and the infuriating, ubiquitous presence of Sir Sidney Smith had begun to erode the bedrock of the French campaign, the unshakable morale of the Armée d'Orient. Napoleon's original timetable was shattered. He had planned for Acre to fall in a matter of days. They were now into the second month of the siege. The toll was becoming unbearable. The desert environment, always unforgiving, turned hostile. Dysentery and plague ripped through the French trenches. The very water and food supply, already tenuous, became contaminated, debilitating the men faster than any cannonball. The reality of the siege forced Napoleon into a desperate, existential gamble. He knew time was no longer on his side. Intelligence reports, now confirmed by captured prisoners, painted a terrifying picture: a massive Ottoman army, composed of thousands of fresh troops from Anatolia and Rhodes, was sailing south. This army, complete with cavalry and heavy stores, was due to land shortly at Abu Qir, just days south of Acre. This impending arrival represented Napoleon's absolute deadline. If Acre did not fall before the Ottoman relief army landed, his entire force would be caught in a catastrophic pincer movement. He would be trapped between a strengthened, resolute fortress in the north and a massive, fresh army to his rear, all while his troops succumbed to disease. The glorious conquest of the East would turn into a humiliating, terminal rout. Napoleon became obsessed. His energy, usually deployed across vast theaters of war, was now focused entirely on this single, miserable, crumbling fortress. He poured every reserve he had into the trenches, driving his men to exhaustion, demanding assaults that were increasingly reckless. He risked his most veteran grenadiers, throwing them into the meat grinder of the breach in a final, frantic attempt to force a breach before the Ottoman reinforcements arrived. He sent increasingly dramatic and personal messages to Smith, attempting to open negotiations for the surrender of the city, or at least a temporary ceasefire, all attempts that Smith, savoring his psychological advantage, ruthlessly rebuffed. Smith understood that the physical strength of the wall no longer mattered. The battle was now one of will, and Napoleon's will was finally showing cracks of desperation. The moment of climax was near. Napoleon knew he had only days left to claim the prize that would justify the entire Egyptian campaign. He prepared for one last, ultimate, make-or-break push, a furious assault of such scale that it would either smash the fortress into submission or consume the last remaining strength of his army. The siege was no longer a tactical challenge, it was a desperate race against the looming deadline of the Ottoman relief army. The arrival of the Ottoman fleet, bearing the massive relief army, was confirmed on the horizon. Napoleon was out of time. With a terrible, focused resolve, he stripped his camps, committing his absolute final reserves, including the elite corps d'élite of the infantry, men who were usually held back for only the most decisive battles. This was the final throw of the dice. The night of May 7th was chosen for the final, catastrophic assault. Under the cover of darkness, the French columns advanced with a renewed, desperate speed, smashing into the already pulverized breach. This time, the assault was nearly irresistible. The defenders were exhausted, their inner retrenchments weakened by continuous mining and artillery fire. The French grenadiers, fighting with the knowledge that failure meant annihilation, managed to surge past the final inner barricade. They swarmed into the last, crucial defensive position, a massive, uncompleted earthwork known simply as the Second Line. Victory was within their grasp. The standard of the French Republic was planted firmly on the rampart. It seemed Acre was finally, irrevocably lost. At this precise, terrifying moment of collapse, the defense was saved by the most unconventional, theatrical, and ultimately decisive maneuver of the entire siege, the Marines in the breach. Sir Sidney Smith, who had been watching the fighting with agonizing tension, knew there were no reserves left. He ordered every single remaining British sailor and Royal Marine to abandon their distant posts and form up at the base of the final earthwork. Then, Smith himself, the Commodore, the Admiral, the Joint Minister Plenipotentiary, a man who should have been commanding from the deck of his ship, did the unthinkable. He led the charge. Leading his handful of Marines, sailors armed with pikes and cutlasses, and a small number of Jez's personal guards, Smith plunged into the chaotic, brutal melee within the breach. This sight was unprecedented, a high-ranking British naval officer, engaging personally, face-to-face, with the French infantry inside a crumbling Ottoman city. The charge was not based on numbers, it was based on shock. The French, believing they had finally broken the resistance, were suddenly confronted by this terrifying, fresh wave of British ferocity. The sailors, fighting with the furious abandon of men fighting for their captain, slammed into the column. But the greater blow was psychological. The The French soldiers had been told the British were merely providing support. They were not meant to be here, fighting with pikes and pistols in the ruins. This shock, coupled with the sudden, fresh injection of disciplined violence, caused the French advance to stall and then fracture. The French line, extended and exhausted, recoiled from the unexpected, disciplined fury. They had defeated the Ottoman troops, but they could not defeat the myth of the British sailor, personally led by the figure Napoleon most despised. The sight of Smith leading the charge broke the French will. They retreated, stumbling back over the bodies of their comrades, taking with them the planted standard. The final, desperate assault, the very culmination of Napoleon's grand Eastern ambition, had been repulsed by a few hundred sailors, driven by the personal charisma and sheer audacity of a single, forgotten hero. Acre was still standing. The night of the final repulse was cold, silent, and decisive. Napoleon stood in his headquarters, a man whose colossal will had finally encountered an immovable object. The news was unavoidable. The great assault had failed, the veteran troops were decimated, and the massive Ottoman relief army was now landing at Abu Qir, cutting off any chance of a sustained siege. His grand Eastern project, his destiny to conquer India and collapse the British Empire, had been halted by a crumbling wall and a handful of English sailors led by his personal enemy. The order was given, retreat. The French army began the agonizing, miserable process of withdrawing from the trenches it had fought so bitterly to secure. They did so under the cover of darkness, but the retreat was a scene of unmitigated suffering and chaos. Napoleon, ever the pragmatist, could not afford the luxury of defeat. He ruthlessly ordered the destruction of all remaining heavy equipment. Anything that could not be carried was broken, burned, or dumped. The very existence of the French campaign had to be erased from the Syrian coastline. The greatest agony, however, fell upon the sick and the wounded. The plague and dysentery had ravaged the French ranks, and thousands of soldiers were too ill to march. Napoleon was faced with a chilling choice: abandon them to the mercy of Jezza Pasha, who offered none, or transport them across the desert, a logistical impossibility. The retreat became a humanitarian disaster. The French were harried by local partisan forces and subjected to the relentless scourge of the desert. Heat, thirst, and disease completed the work that the British and Ottoman cannon had started. The glorious army that had marched with such assurance toward destiny was now reduced to a shuffling column of suffering, demoralized men. Napoleon himself maintained a stoic, frightening silence. He would later dismiss the siege with a curt, bitter assessment: "That man made me miss my destiny." He knew the profound magnitude of his failure. Acre was not just a lost battle, it was the hinge upon which the future of the world had turned. Forced back to Egypt, Napoleon's strategic position became untenable. The invasion of the East was over. He had been stopped, not by a grand army, but by the reckless, defiant spirit of the forgotten genius, Sir Sidney Smith. The failure at Acre reverberated through Napoleon's career, casting a long, enduring shadow over his otherwise flawless reputation. He arrived back in Egypt a changed man, his air of invincibility tarnished, his grand vision of an Eastern empire reduced to dust. The magnitude of the catastrophe was immediately clear. Napoleon, the master of propaganda, could not mask the fact that he had marched his army halfway across the world only to be repulsed by a force he deemed contemptible. He was quick to assign blame, but his private utterances revealed the true depth of his bitterness. It was in a moment of rare candor, years later, reflecting on the siege, that Napoleon delivered the ultimate indictment. "That man," he said, referring to Sidney Smith, "made me miss my destiny." This quote is the perfect summary of Acre's historical significance. Napoleon genuinely believed his fate was to create a unified Franco-Oriental empire, to dismantle British power in India, and to return to Europe as a second Alexander the Great. That destiny was now forever unattainable. The 3,000 square yards of crumbling wall at Acre represented the absolute limit of his power, a frontier he could not cross. Napoleon's greatest folly at Acre was not a tactical mistake, but a psychological one: arrogance. He refused to believe that the eccentric, controversial Smith was capable of coordinated military brilliance. He underestimated the capacity of the Ottoman defenders to be stiffened by professional resolve. He allowed his personal loathing for Smith to cloud his judgment, driving him to throw good soldiers after bad, prolonging a siege he should have abandoned weeks earlier. The political consequences were immediate. Recognizing that the entire campaign had culminated in failure and attrition, Napoleon realized his position in Egypt was terminal. Acre was the justification for his covert departure a few months later. He slipped away from Egypt, leaving his stranded army under the command of General Kleber, desperate to return to France and salvage his political career before the news of his true military disaster broke in Europe. Acre, the unheralded medieval ruin, had not just defeated a French army, it had forced Napoleon to abandon his dream. It was a victory of personality over prophecy, of improvisation over logistics, and it fundamentally altered the course of Napoleon's life, pushing him away from the East and back toward the European wars where he would ultimately meet his final fate. The small, dirty siege had, in essence, created the conditions for the rise of the European empire that followed, born directly from the ashes of his Middle Eastern failure. Sir Sidney Smith returned to the Mediterranean fleet a hero in the eyes of the Ottoman world, and a profound irritant to his own government and senior officers. While the Sultan decorated him lavishly, bestowing titles and gifts, the Admiralty in London and the influential voices in the Royal Navy treated his victory with a mixture of grudging acknowledgement and icy resentment. The core of the controversy lay in Smith's inherent nature. He was a law unto himself. Acre was a victory achieved outside the established command structure, through sheer personal audacity and diplomatic maneuvering that verged on insubordination. He had usurped military authority from Ottoman officials and had managed a campaign thousands of miles away from any direct oversight. Admiral Lord Nelson, the undisputed titan of the sea, was particularly vocal in his disdain. Nelson despised Smith's theatrical flair and his knack for self-promotion. He viewed Smith not as a strategic hero, but as a meddling, amateur adventurer who received disproportionate credit for a small, fortunate engagement. Nelson's powerful opinion ensured that Smith's accomplishments at Acre were consistently downplayed in official dispatches and in the influential London press. The narrative became less about tactical genius and more about a lucky fluke and the fortuitous interception of the siege train. Furthermore, Smith had made a mess of the peace. He signed a highly controversial convention with the French in El Arish, agreeing to allow Napoleon's stranded army to evacuate Egypt and return to France. This was a diplomatic disaster for Britain, as it would have reinforced Napoleon's strength just when Europe was rallying against him. The British government immediately and publicly repudiated the treaty, humiliating Smith and reinforcing the impression that he was politically reckless. The court of opinion dismissed the victory at Acre precisely because the winner was so unorthodox. His independent success was an implicit criticism of the rigid, seniority-based Royal Navy system. Smith was never afforded the recognition or the subsequent command positions commensurate with the victory he had delivered. Thus, the man who saved the East became, within his own empire, a forgotten genius. The great victory was subtly minimized and overshadowed by the sheer magnitude of Nelson's own fame. This systemic professional jealousy ensured that Acre would be filed away not as the hinge of history, but as a lucky distraction, a testament to how easily the official history can erase the most crucial deeds of its most nonconformist heroes. The cost of the Siege of Acre, in terms of human lives and wasted material, was high. But the true cost, the geopolitical cost, was priceless. The failure of Napoleon's grand design on the small strip of coastline proved that history is often made in inches, not miles. The defense of Acre, an operation spanning barely 33 days of concentrated fighting across a mere 3,000 yards of crumbling wall, achieved three seismic geopolitical shifts that determined the map of the 19th century. Firstly, Acre guaranteed the security of India. By forcing Napoleon to retreat from the Levant, Smith slammed shut the land gate to the east. The British East India Company could continue its operations and consolidation without the existential threat of a Franco-Mysorean invasion. The greatest source of British wealth and power was secured, allowing the British Empire to fund the relentless European wars against Napoleon for another 16 years. Secondly, Acre saved the Ottoman Empire. At the turn of the century, the vast Ottoman domain was universally regarded as the sick man of Europe, ripe for dismemberment. Napoleon's invasion was intended to hasten that collapse. The defense of Acre, however, gave the Sultanate a crucial victory, restoring its prestige, buying it time, and most importantly, affirming its alliance with Britain. The Ottoman Empire, though perpetually troubled, would survive for more than another century, directly influencing the balance of power in the Balkans and the Middle East until World War I. Finally, Acre was the catalyst for the Second Coalition. Napoleon's defeat, coupled with the realization that he was stranded and vulnerable, encouraged the hesitant powers of Europe, Austria, Russia, and Portugal, to join Britain in a renewed military alliance against France. Acre stripped Napoleon of his aura of invincibility and provided the necessary psychological impetus for the European monarchs to fight back. In essence, Acre proved that the unstoppable force could be stopped. The entire political landscape was transformed by the actions of a few hundred men led by a rogue commodore. The siege was not a major battle in the context of the Napoleonic Wars, yet it was arguably the single most important one, preserving the geopolitical status quo and securing the path of British global supremacy for 100 years. That tiny patch of ruined medieval stone dictated the course of modern history. The story of Acre concludes not with the grand parade of a victorious army, but with the quiet, lasting truth of a victory that should never have happened. The enduring legacy of the Siege of Acre is twofold. It is a lesson in the fragility of destiny, and a testament to the power of unconventional warfare. For Napoleon, Acre remained the great what-if. It taught him that even the most meticulously calculated military machine could be derailed by a single, determined human personality. The siege became a painful reference point, forever reminding him that logistical perfection could be undone by moral failure and personal enmity. In that sense, Acre was the first time Napoleon was truly defeated, not just repulsed, marking the point where his relentless march toward absolute power was finally challenged by a conscience, or at least, by a better, faster mind. But the true legacy belongs to Sir Sidney Smith. His actions at Acre established principles that would quietly revolutionize naval and military thinking. Firstly, combined arms warfare. Smith shattered the rigid doctrine that separated land and sea power. He demonstrated that small, flexible naval units could decisively influence a major land siege through tactical use of enfilading fire and by converting sailors into effective, professional infantry in the breach. Secondly, the power of the local ally. Smith proved that integrating Western technological superiority with local knowledge and local ferocity, even under a tyrant like Jeza Pasha, was exponentially more effective than attempting to fight alone. Yet, despite these profound lessons, Smith himself faded into historical obscurity, his victory eclipsed by the later, more spectacular triumphs of Nelson and Wellington. He became the prototype of the forgotten genius, the man whose pivotal, world-changing contribution was too complex, too diplomatic, and too unconventional to fit neatly into the history books. The ruins of Acre stand today as a monument to that impossible moment. It was a victory of will over calculus, a triumph of desperation over destiny. It is the perfect illustration that in the chaotic, high-stakes game of global power, sometimes, all it takes is one audacious man, a handful of disciplined sailors, and a miraculous twist of fate to change the course of the world forever. The victory at Acre was not in the winning, but in the preventing Napoleon from completing the greatest strategic move in his career, and thereby safeguarding the foundation of the modern world.